Hi, this is Caroline Levitt, author of Cruel, Beautiful World, and you're listening to the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast, a podcast where we invite you to spend just a few minutes with the staff at Cook Library. We took a little break after the holidays and it accidentally evolved into a much longer break than intended, but we are back now and ready to get back into talking about what we're reading, watching, and listening to. I'm Nate Goss, and I'm here today with Jean, one of our Adult Services librarians, and today we're doing another quick draw comics segment where we highlight one comic book that is worth your time. So, Jean, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't we just go ahead and jump right into it? What is the comic that you would like to recommend for our listeners today?
The comic that I am recommending is called Cook Korean, and it's a little bit unique in that it is a comic book, but at the same time, it's a cookbook. So basically, it's a book of recipes that are drawn in the style of a comic book.
Now, do you read a lot of comics?
I don't read a ton, so this was kind of a departure for me. That's why I kind of hesitate to call it a cookbook, because I think when people hear cookbook, they imagine recipes that are typed up with photographs, and this is all illustrations, drawings, comics. So it's a little bit different, but in terms of structure, I would say it's similar to a cookbook.
So when you see the food, you're actually not even seeing pictures of the food?
You are not seeing pictures of food. It is all drawings.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Robin Ha, who's the author of this Cook Korean, the
Yes.
cookbook, why do you think she chose to do a Korean cookbook as a comic?
I think it started out as a Tumblr blog where she's a graphic artist, and so that's kind of her background. And so she talks about her food journey and kind of merging her two loves together. So I think that is kind of how the book evolved. But I think it's a perfect format for people who may not be familiar with Korean food or Korean cooking. It's a great introduction. It's really fun, lighthearted. So it's a great way to get to know more about the food and Korean culture.
Sure. And so what drew you personally to the book?
Well, I read about it first in NPR's Best of 2016 list, and so that's kind of how I heard about it. And I jumped on her blog and was really interested, and so that is kind of what introduced me to the book itself. And then my kids happen to love Korean food, so I was looking for a good cookbook recipe. My mom is a great cook, but a lot of her what I try to learn from her is just, throw in a little bit of this, throw in a little bit of that. It's kind of hard to follow. Yeah, exactly. So I needed something that was more structured.
So speaking of structure, when it comes to the actual book itself, when you're looking through it, it's not just recipe after recipe after recipe.
No.
It does sort of tie in some of her story as well.
It does.
So did you read it from beginning to end, or what do you think is the right way to read this book?
I don't really think there is a right way. A lot of people do this with cookbooks where you kind of jump to a section that interests you. So essentially, like I said, it is structured similar to a cookbook in that it's organized by side dishes or meats and poultry and seafood, so different categories. But before each chapter, she includes a little introductory comic, which gives a little bit of background information. So, for example, before the meat section, she talks about Korean barbecue and how to eat it and that type of thing.
Yeah.
So really, you can just jump around in the book, which, again, I think is another good reason that it's great for people who may not be familiar with the food of Korea. It's just enough information to feel like you're learning about it, but it's not so overwhelming. And the format itself, I think, lends itself to being a really fun way to get to know a food of a different culture.
Yeah, I had some time to kind of look through the book, and I have absolutely no familiarity with Korean cooking whatsoever. I'm familiar with the idea of kimchi, and that's about where it stops.
Right.
But what I liked was it was written kind of for that. Like it's such a good primer for Korean cooking.
Absolutely.
Like she kind of defines all the terms and talks about the main ingredients of each dish and before jumping into the specific recipes, which I really appreciated. But, one thing I wanted to ask is, you were talking a little bit about like your mother's cooking. What was your familiarity with Korean cooking before reading this? And if you had a lot of familiarity with Korean cooking, how does this compare? Like, is it pretty, true to what your idea of Korean cooking is?
It is. So I grew up eating Korean food. So for me, I guess you could say I am familiar with Korean food, not necessarily cooking it, but eating it.
Sure. The more enjoyable part.
Yes, exactly. So, but what part of the reason that I really like this book, and I think you bring up a good point in terms of this being a great Korean primer or introduction to Korean cooking, I feel the same way because probably 90% of the recipes that are in this book are recipes that my mom actually made us growing up.
Wow.
So I feel like it's very representative of Korean cooking and what you would actually find on a Korean dinner table at any given time.
Did you have a favorite recipe in the book, or how many have you tried?
I've tried a number of them. My kids, my family tends to like really spicy food, so I've tried a number of the spicy items. There's a spicy beef soup, spicy pork dish. We've done the pan-fried tofu. They've all loved everything. And like I said, it's very authentic.
So, living in this area, Libertyville, Vernon Hills kind of area, is it easy enough to find these ingredients that people could actually read the cookbook and have an easy enough time finding what they need to make it?
They are. And like you said, at the very beginning of the book, she kind of talks about the Korean pantry and what you would typically find in there. So that's a great place to start in terms of, finding the ingredients that you need for pretty much every recipe within the book. But there are Asian food stores in many of the suburbs. I think it's pretty easy to find some of the ingredients even in your local grocery store, like Whole Foods has a lot, a great Asian section. So I would think that it would be pretty easy to find most of these things. And that, that's another reason that I do like this book, because a lot of times I've read cookbooks in the past where you're thinking, this all sounds great on paper, but first of all, I don't know where to get any of these ingredients. And secondly, it's not something that you would make on a normal Tuesday night,
Sure.
Whereas I feel these recipes are dishes that Korean families actually eat on a daily basis.
Yeah. That's great. Do you think someone who is more just looking for a cookbook and is listening to this and is like, oh, it sounds like a good cookbook, are they going to have an easy time acclimating to the comic format, you think, with it? Like, how hard was it? Was there any difference for you actually doing a recipe, reading it as a comic versus reading it as, a recipe that we're used to finding either on a blog or in a regular cookbook?
Right. Not really. I thought it was really fun. Again, I love the colors, and I think it's very eye-catching. And it was actually a great way for me to get my kids involved in it, because they would sit down. I would ask them, like, what ingredients do we need? Or, and they were kind of involved with this whole process. And again, because they love Korean cooking, it was kind of a fun family thing for us to do together. But she does, even though it's not typed out in terms of like the recipes, she does list all of the ingredients. She kind of puts everything in a step-by-step format. So in terms of that, it's going to be pretty easy for anyone to follow.
Yeah, great. All right, well, Jean, I just want to thank you for being on the podcast and for this delicious recommendation. Listeners out there, if you would like to reserve a copy of Cook Korean, visit our website at www.cooklib.org and search the title in our catalog. And in fact, if you search Korean cooking, you'll see dozens of other Korean cookbooks also available for checkout. But while you're on that website, don't forget to also visit Shelf Life, the library's blog. In fact, Jean did write up an actual blog post about Cook Korean that you can read and maybe learn a few things about the book that you didn't learn through this podcast. The blog's address is shelflife.cooklib.org. If you ever want to get in touch and leave some feedback, maybe send us a message, you can always do that at webmaster@cooklib.org. And if you enjoy this podcast, just keep spreading the word, and if you get a moment, maybe leave us a kind rating on iTunes. We will be back soon, but until then, keep reading, keep watching, and keep listening.